So, well, guys, I wanted to welcome those. How many of you have, this is your first week back since we've started our series on intimacies? Anybody's first week? Everybody had a week in here? Good. All right. Well, guys, we are on week 3, and before we delve off into what we have to share today, I wanted to cover real quickly in a bit of a review those things that we covered in week 1 and in week 2. In week 1, we looked at the 4 elements needed to have a strong marriage, and those elements were security, meaningful communication, romantic and emotional experiences, and physical touch. Now, we actually have that particular week recorded, so if you'd like to see it, let me know. We can send you the video of that week. We did record that one. Last week, we asked 3 questions that we felt that every married couple needed to be asking, and the first one was, who did God create sex for? So based upon what we talked about last week, who did God create sex for? Who and only who? In the covenant of marriage. Who did God not create sex for? What's that? In things that not that. And that's good. And I laughed when I heard another preacher teach that, and he was teaching in a church that had singles, married people, and his point was, so if you do not have a husband or a wife, you do not get to have sex. And he was very clear, and yet today we see that line being pushed. And we talked about a little bit last week about some of the negative repercussions that I believe we see culturally that I think some couples are bringing into relationships because of the challenges of us not honoring God's design for intimacy in marriage. And then last, what did God create sex for? For procreation, which was the obvious one. Then also he created that for meeting physical and emotional needs, misspelling there, and then for our pleasure, And so what I wanted to do today was I wanted to cover some questions that we had discussed last week that I believe, think should be asked and answered by every married couple. And this week's questions, we're going to look at these 4 things. So if you want to write these down, these are the 4 that we're going to look at today. Number 1 is, how much sex is normal? How much sex is normal? This week I was talking with another one of our pastoral team, and it was so funny when I told him I was going to teach on this. We began the discussion that a lot of times guys have who are real close, and we talked about how when he was a engaged person about to be married, and he was one of the people who would have broken my stats. He was a virgin when he married his wife, and so he was ready for his wedding night. And over the discussion, we talked about what his impression of how much they were intimate when they first got married. Then one kid came along, and that definitely changed things. And now they're pregnant with their second, and she's like 8 months along. That's definitely changed things. But what the affirmation was that because their relationship isn't built only on that they're in a very healthy place as a couple, and he is also not in a bad place mentally, physiologically, and physically doing things that he shouldn't be doing, and we're going to talk about that next week, because of the element of sin that brings into his life and into your marriage. And so we're going to talk today about how much sex is normal, what to do when one spouse doesn't want sex but the other does. We're going to spend a lot of our time on that particular area today, and I think you'll hopefully glean some great, very practical and biblical information from that. Then last week we broke everybody up into 2 groups, and the ladies asked some questions, the guys asked some questions, and so the one that the ladies said they wanted to hear about today was, how can we balance mom mode and our husband's desire for sex? So we're going to look at that today. How do you balance mom mode and our husband's desire for sex? And we're going to look at that biblically. And then lastly, the guys get to trail up at the end. What do women want from sex? Every man wants to know the answer to that, right? What do they want? And so we're going to talk about those 4 things today, and we're going to jump right into it. As we know, I want to start something as we begin today, a foundation that we've set in our prior weeks with, I think, some overviews, but I want to be clear about them. As we know, men and women are wired differently. Therefore, the way that they look at and process life, including intimacy, is obviously very different. First of all, we know that they are different emotionally. Men generally are not emotionally driven. So men basically struggle, and oftentimes, to connect emotionally with their wives, and we looked at that in week 1. Women are generally very emotionally driven. They need the emotional connection generally to even move towards intimacy, and they are usually really frustrated with the lack of emotional connection with their husband. They're also different physiologically. Guys, we hear it all the time that men's sex drive is totally related to the hormone testosterone. And the reality is that hormone so significantly drives a man's sexual desire that it is literally a frustration when testosterone is driving him to a place of intimacy and then he's shut down. Now, doesn't mean that that's right or wrong on the wife's part if she's shutting him down, and we're going to look at in a moment how is that to be balanced out. But for him, literally, it is such a big deal that it is the thing that brings him joy. He receives joy from being intimate with his wife. It gives him that sense of connection. But on the other side, wives find this difficult. They find that physiological connection very difficult because they are emotional and they would rather communicate. And I get a great example from Dr. Gary Smalley. I love this story, and I'm going to use his little story as an example. He said, imagine that, wives, you were at home and a knock comes at the door and a courier says, you guys have just won the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. You have just won $20,000 for life. And here, just sign this document. This money is yours. This is legal. The lawyer will come in and he'll fill this out. And you are so excited. And you wait till your husband gets home. And right when he walks in the door, you're about to tell him. And he goes, hold on. She goes, I've got something to tell you. I cannot wait to tell you. You will not believe what happened today. Okay, honey, I know. I am exhausted. Just give me a minute. I need to just go take a nap. But I want to hear what you have to say, and don't tell anybody else. I know this is exciting. I really want to hear it, but don't tell anybody else, okay? Just let me take a nap. So your husband takes a nap, and you're still all excited. How many ladies are already feeling like, I got to tell him, you know? And so you can't wait to tell him. And he sleeps literally till about 10:30 or 11. He gets up for a minute, and he watches the news. Just let me get the news. I got to check on something for tomorrow. So he listens to the news, and he is so tired, he dozes off to sleep before you get to tell him. Are you feeling the anxiety? Are you feeling like, wait, I wanted to tell you? And are you frustrated, ladies? Would you be frustrated with, I have this huge news I need to tell you, and I've waited all day to tell you, and finally I get the chance to tell you, and you go to sleep, and I don't get to tell you. You go to bed very frustrated. The reality is that that's the way that a lot of men feel when they come home with the testosterone-driven, physiologically driven desire for intimacy. That when they can't have that opportunity to share that with you, they're frustrated. And if you didn't get to tell your husband about the Publishers Clearinghouse, and ultimately he went to bed without even talking to you about it, you're not only disappointed that you didn't get to share it, you're hurt. You feel like he didn't care. This was huge news that I needed to tell you. And often we don't look at it from that standpoint, that this is not something that a guy deals with lightly. It is something that is very significant for a male. And so as a resident male, I wanted to share that, but I also believe that it is a balance, because one of the other ways that men and women and people in general have differences in attitudes toward intimacy is personality. There are all types of different personalities, and all of us have a different personality. How many of you have ever taken a personality quiz with your spouse so that you know what theirs is and you know what yours is, and whether they're compatible and whether they're not? And guys, the reality is there are literally compatibility pairs, and there are ones that are not so good to be compatible with. And in my case, I was so thankful that God knew better than me, because I really didn't know what type of personality I was looking for. I was probably the only guy that ever did this, but I'm just looking at the surface, she's pretty okay. And so I was not looking at the personalities, right? But God knew what type of girl that I needed. And so long before I found my wife someone I wanted to date, I found her being funny. And she was easy to be around. And she helped me relax. And she also made fun of me so that I couldn't be so serious. And I love that about my wife. I fell in love with her personality and who she was long before all the other incredible attributes that she has. And so, if you are a person that has the big, domineering type A personality, you are going to look at and relate to intimacy differently than the person who maybe has a quieter, more reserved personality. It reminds me of the story I heard about the football player, this big NFL football player was telling his therapist about a story that had happened on he and his wife's honeymoon. They had had the wedding day, and they were headed to the honeymoon, and they were almost to the hotel, and they got into a spat about something. He doesn't even remember what it was about, but they were, at odds and having a little friction. So when they got into the hotel room, he's this big, strapping type A guy. I'm going to take control. So he takes his pants off, and he holds them up, and he says, "Hey," and he throws them over at her, "I want you to put these on." And so, these are big, big pants. And so she takes the pants, and she says, I can't put these on. These are too big. He goes, "That's right. I just want you to know who wears the pants in these house, all right?" And so she reaches over in her suitcase. She takes out a little lacy pair of underwear, and she shoots them all across the room at him. "Hey, you put those on." And he picks them up. "I can't put these on. I could never get into these." He says, "That's right, mister. Until you change your attitude, you're probably never going to get into those." And so the issue is that often we've got to change our attitude about how we're looking at intimacy. We're going to have to adjust that. So fellas, if you want a better sex life, you may consider changing your attitude. A recent Time magazine article, and I found this interesting, declared that sex and health go hand in hand. Research has linked sex to a slimmer waistline, a stronger heart, and a lower risk for prostate and breast cancers, and it is also a boon for mental health since sex is associated with lower rates of depression and better mood. But according to that same article, a study appearing in the Archives of Sexual Behavior said that Americans today, and I was shocked at this, are having sex less than Americans a decade ago. Researchers found that from 2010 to 2014, the average American adult had sex 9 fewer times per year than Americans did from 2000 to 2004. And we find this kind of startling because of our completely overly sexualized society and the culture that we live in. But this study still said it also suggested that the drop in frequency was even steeper for married couples, suggesting that they had sex 16 fewer times in a year. So what's going on? We obviously have to ask the question, so what's going on? Well, we can only speculate, says the study's author, Jean Twenge, a professor of psychology at San Diego State University and the author of the book, Generation Me. But, she says, the increase in dual income households and the amount of times couples split between working and parenting may be possible explanations for the drop in sex amongst married couples. And then she goes on to say, plus, and guys get this, plus with the rise in quality and accessibility of streaming entertainment, Competition for free time is stiffer. The allure of Netflix and other device-based diversions may be elbowing sex aside. Wow. And I laughed at the one example, which the two weren't related, of our couple who went on the date. They laughed. They went back into the bedroom and they're watching Netflix on the tablet. And I'd admit, for my wife and I, our date nights at home, man, we are getting us some takeout. We're ordering Outback Steakhouse, having it delivered to the door, and we just tear up some Dateline. We tear up a Dateline murder mystery, and it's the most awesome date night, and we love it. And we look across the room at 10 o'clock when the news comes on, and we just go, we are so old. And we love it, but and that's us. But this brings us to our first question for today. How much sex is normal for a healthy married couple? All right, y'all get ready to write. I hear this question often, especially from newlywed couples. They want to know this couple. I have the intimacy section is the very last one when I do a couple's wedding. That's the last one that we discuss, and we do discuss intimacy in my premarital counseling. And it's not like, okay, this goes here and that goes there, and it's not like that. More often than not, as you guys have heard my statistics, I am not talking to two people who are virgins. I am not talking to two people who are unfamiliar with the process of sexual intimacy. What I am often talking to are people with very distorted perceptions, beliefs, and images about it. And so, but no matter how often you have sex, and this is the big thing. You were looking for the number, weren't you? You were looking for what is the big number. Guys, no matter how often you have sex, what matters is whether you are both satisfied and fulfilled. What matters most is whether you're both satisfied and fulfilled. So what's normal isn't the issue, it's about what works for you. So I was reading my outline for my wife last night, and she said, no, you better not tell them what's normal for us. And I'm like, honey, all I'm saying is your normal and my normal is different from everybody else's normal, but everybody has to have a normal. She said, I'm just telling them, if you get a number, I will slap you. And I'm like, all right, no number. So in addition to the Time magazine studied above, other studies have shown that sexual frequency in married couples range from 4 times to 45 times per month after 2 years of marriage. Now, I know it's suggested that newlyweds tend to be a lot more intimate than people who have been married 2 years or longer, and certainly more than people who have had their first child. And that's kind of goes to reason that you don't have a lot of the distractions that you have even after 2 years of marriage without kids. Jobs are different. The stresses of actually knowing your partner in some ways that you didn't think you wanted to know them. All these things come into play 2 years into your marriage, and they do affect your intimacy. So as chances are, your frequency is impacted by the season of life you're in. Do you have a baby or young kids at home? Does one of you work a shift that isn't conducted to frequent romance in the bedroom? Are you helping to care for elderly parents or in-laws? That was a big one. I have a lot of couples, especially in my older classes, that are dealing with aging parents. And they were ready for their empty nester years when their kids were in high school, and they were going to get to do some fun stuff together. But now they're taking care of aging parents, especially with the onset of people living longer and diseases like Alzheimer and dementia setting in. That becomes a horrible, horrible mood killer when you are trying to take care of an elderly parent. Ironically, from a lot of the things that I'm experiencing with the couples that I'm talking to who are struggling with that, it was worse for them taking care of their parents and all the stresses that comes with than when they were trying to take care of their kids. At least the kids were manageable in their own home, dealing with an adult who either is in senior care or even in your home, and especially add in the dementia and the other things. That's tough, and it is a mood killer. So there are a lot of different reasons why a couple's life circumstances may lower the frequency of sex. But, and here's a big one, even when the quantity goes down If a couple focuses on the quality of the experience, the joy for both partners goes up. I love Song of Solomon because Song of Solomon, again, I was literally a single adult in my 30s, probably before I heard Song of Solomon taught the way it was intended, the way it was written. It is a sensual book about love, sex, marriage, courting, all of that. Courting should have been first in that scenario. How many of you know who Tommy Nelson is from Denton Bible? Tommy Nelson is the senior pastor at Denton Bible Church up in Denton, and he is literally probably renowned around the world for his teaching on Song of Solomon. And in 1992, I went to one of the most life-changing, for me as a single at the time, conferences I'd ever gone to. Our church hosted him, and he talked about intimacy from the Song of Solomon perspective. And guys, it is one of the most sensual, sexual, straight up in your face books about intimacy and marriage. And one of the things that I loved about it, it has so many word pictures. Here's one. How beautiful is your love, my sister, my bride. How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than any spice. If you broke all that down and you looked at what metaphors they were using, these were very, very sensual. So in the case where they had talked about, they described the quality of their sexual experience. In Song of Solomon, it even gets to the point when you're going to see in just a minute where, okay, we've been married a little while, what happens then? It even addresses that, and we're going to show you that in a second. These couples, though, who have learned to balance the emotional intimacy and understanding of one another's needs, they find that they have a much more fulfilling sexual life despite lower frequency. And so for those guys who are going, you know what, our frequency has dropped significantly, and the women are like, I just can't. Guys, the quality of that experience is what matters, and I want to really encourage you. It's funny, when I sit in my wedding counseling sessions with premarital couples, and I said this last week, I am literally trying to keep them sometimes off of each other in my office. I mean, there are those couples that have come in and they're loving. I'm like, if you need a room, it's next door, but you can't use it. All right, just so you know, y'all need to cool it down a little bit. And I will tell them, you know, here's your boundary. We are abstinent until our wedding night. And then I embarrass the bride every wedding night because I walk up. I said, I have told you, do not even look googly-eyed, sexy-eyed at each other for 6 weeks. Get out of here and go have sex. All right, you will hate these people at Thanksgiving and wish they would go home. Do not dance with them all night. Go have sex with your husband. And he's like, thank you, man. Thank you. And he and I are always buddies after that. But the reality is, once we get to the marriage side of it, suddenly sex is suddenly the thing that's up for discussion. It is the poker chip often used to determine how a couple is going to respond to one another, because it gets used as a bartering tool, and that's not how God designed it. Every couple has their own individual set of intimacy needs. If you're having sex at a frequency that feels low to you, talk about it. Check in with each other and ask if you're both happy with your sex life. This is the very best way to learn when you're in sync with your partner's sexual needs and whether you need to work together to make adjustments. And the key is not to just reach a certain level of normalcy. Instead, the key is to be satisfied. That's a much easier and a much more enjoyable goal to work toward. But the idea that every couple is not only capable of having a healthy discussion about their marital intimacy, but they're actually able to resolve those differences is sadly not the case. Unfortunately, many couples, especially Christian couples, who have often been taught since puberty that sex was dirty and bad and ugly, they struggle to communicate openly and honestly about sexual needs, desires, or frustrations. And this leads us to our second question for today. What do you do when one partner wants to have sex but the other doesn't? Now, before I share my thoughts on this next section, I want to clarify something that we really established earlier in the series, but it I think warrants bringing it up again. A lot of what's discussed in these types of studies, even in Christian studies and the stuff that I've been reading, y'all have been reading, and my kids keep coming up and joking me, "What are you reading about, Daddy? What are you reading about?" And my wife told me, she's like, "Please don't leave this book out for the kids to see." I'm like, "Honey, I won't." But it's research. Get ready to be my research partner. And she's like, "No." And she walks out of the room. Men generally want to have sex more than women. Guys, this is a generality that I think we all accept, but when I share with you what I'm about to share, I'm going to use that as a generality that we all accept, and that women are generally the ones who struggle with not wanting to have sex as often. So when sharing this next section, the majority of the content is geared towards helping the women biblically address their lack of sexual desire for their husbands, but that does not mean that the content can't be applied by men as well. And so on that note, when one partner wants to have sex but the other doesn't, what do? Maybe you can relate to one wife's thoughts expressed below. She said, "I'd already gotten settled in bed, wearing my flannel nightgown and reading my book. But now that my husband is in the mood, I'm just not sure if I want to go through all the trouble. I just don't." What we laughed at was really a quote exactly, you guys, from Song of Songs, Psalm of Solomon 5:2-3, which says this: "I was sleeping, but my heart is awake. The sound of my lover was knocking." And so this was him saying, "I was sleeping, but my heart was awake." Then she says, "The sound of my lover, he's knocking at the door." And he's outside saying, "Open to me, my sister, my friend, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is wet with dew, my hair with the moisture of the night." So, he had been outside, and the custom of those days, because of the way that Middle Eastern culture, it was so hot at night, the men would sit outside, usually in a high place, way up on the roof. And if you've seen some movies, that you'll see they sleep outside because it's hot, and they make the women sleep inside in the oven for whatever reason. And so he's outside, the dew has come on top of his head, and you know what? He has decided, "I want to go sit with my lady." And so she then says, "Oh, hold on. Wait, no. I have taken off my robe, and I then have to put it on. I have bathed my feet. Am I then to soil them?" So literally what this woman had said is shared with us from a biblical perspective. This is in there, y'all. I promise you. You go read it. It's in there. Guys, sometimes the well-worn excuse, "I've got a headache today, honey," is actually true. Just the thought of having sex makes your head hurt, and this is talking to women, and maybe your heart hurt as well. It's hard to feel amorous when you're angry or disappointed, and it's equally difficult to satisfy your husband sexually if you're not attracted to him. So what do? You may be surprised that the scriptures can shed some insight into why, and this was wives in quotation, but it could be any partner, may be feeling resistant or resentful when it comes to intimacy in the bedroom. So in the passage that we read last week from 1 Corinthians 7, Paul wrote this, and I think you guys remember, "The wife's body does not belong only to her. It also belongs to her husband. And in the same way, the husband's body does not only belong to him, it also belongs to his wife." And then verse 5, "You shouldn't stop giving yourselves to each other. You might possibly do this when you agree to it, and you should only agree to it to give yourselves time to pray." That's in the NIV Reader's Version, and I liked that version because it's clear. It's very clear. For years, these two verses have been used to browbeat wives into feeling guilty for not wanting sex or for avoiding it. But notice that Paul, and I love this, guys, listen to this. Notice that Paul doesn't say a wife's body belongs only to her spouse. It says it belongs also to her spouse. So as one flesh, a wife shares her body with her husband. Biblical commentaries also point out that when Paul was saying we belong to one another, he's not just emphasizing our ownership rights over one another, but he's also clarifying that our exclusive conjugal rights belong only to each other as husband and wives. No outside people allowed. So this passage does not teach that a wife, or a husband for that matter, should submit to sex whenever, wherever, or however their partner demands it, no matter how they feel. Rather, it teaches that since the husband's body belongs to the wife, she should care about it enough to give it pleasure when she possibly can, and he likewise with her body. And in the same way, since the husband's body belongs to the wife, she should be understanding and generous with it when it's not in the mood, and he likewise with her body. So the emphasis here is on mutuality and not selfishness, which leads us to one of the questions that the ladies asked us about last week, and this is question 3 for today. How can we balance mom mode and our husband's desire for sex? All right, so we just saw in the last passage that our bodies belong to each other. And so while the Bible's not saying if you don't feel like having sex, you do it anyway, that the wife's not a slave to the husband, that she should be putting his needs and his body in the same category she would put her own, because that's the way God shows it to us. So let's read again 1 Corinthians 7:5. You shouldn't stop giving yourselves to each other. You might possibly do this when you agree to it, and you should only agree to it to give yourselves time to pray. And so it says here, at first reading, this passage may also seem to teach that sex is a duty, a required act. But duty in this verse is better translated as sacred responsibility. Paul is advising couples to continue to have sex on a regular basis because sex is at the heart of our sacred oneness and helps to protect our fidelity. The intent of this duty isn't a wife complies with a husband's selfish appetite for sex on demand or vice versa, but to fulfill her sacred obligation to these 3 things and likewise him for her. It meets sexual needs, it helps keep the marriage bed pure, and it guards against sexual temptation. Now I want to look at another passage that similarly addresses this in Ephesians 5:28. And it says, husbands are told to love their wives as their own bodies, but then here in verse 29, Paul continues with, after all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and he cares for it, just as Christ does the church. So God describes a husband who loves his wife so much that he puts her needs as high on the chart as his own bodily needs. So in regards to sex, if a husband loves his wife, as Ephesians 5:29 describes, there's no danger at all that he'll mistreat her or take sexual advantage of her. In God's ideal picture of marriage, if a wife wasn't feeling up to sex for whatever reason, the husband would honor and respect her feelings as if it were himself who wasn't in the mood. If a husband doesn't love his wife in this way, he, not she, is sinning when he expects his wife to be available for intercourse on demand and without regard for her feelings. Okay, so now we see that God didn't intend for the wife to be the slave to her husband's sexual needs. However, and this is the part that I want to make sure that we hear as well, on the other extreme, saying that a wife has no responsibility or can shrink her or shirk her obligation to nurture a healthy, ongoing sexual relationship is equally wrong and unbiblical. A wife who regularly refuses to have sex or is only willing to be intimate with her husband on her terms is also acting selfishly. And it says here, if you consistently rebuff your husband's sexual advances and resent intercourse, you need to take active, positive steps towards restoring consistent and mutually satisfying lovemaking in your marriage. So, guys, I wanted to give you 10 quick practical tips for restoring your mutually satisfying intimacy if this is an area where you guys are struggling, where y'all are having a challenge in this area. I want to give you 10 steps for restoring intimacy. And the first one is communicate. And that means, ladies, communicate with your husband. Make sure he knows you're actively pursuing positive changes. Assure him that you understand that you have a part in your sexual problems in your marriage. And be sure that he knows that your goal is for both of you to be sexually satisfied. As a man, when I know that my wife is admitting, you know what, I know We haven't been in sync lately. I've been tired. We've been traveling. We've had kid stuff and this and that. As long as she talks to me about it, even if I approach her about it first, it helps me to know that we're not having an issue. Because for men, ladies, let's remember, for us, the emotional connection for us that you get out of just talking to us and communicating with us in marriage comes from intimacy. And sexual intimacy is the way that we feel that connection with you. And if we don't have that, doesn't matter how you spin it, doesn't matter what you want to say about it, that connection does not happen for us. And ultimately, we begin to really, really have a challenge in our heart regarding our marriage, and especially how we think you feel about us. All right, so don't forget that. Next one, take a time out for sex. This goes back to 1 Corinthians 5:7, where Paul says to not deny each other except for a time of prayer. The reason isn't for sexual hiatus isn't to avoid sex, it's to pray and take active steps to bring about change. So many couples will often say that they're going to do this, and it really is a cop-out for someone to say, okay, we need to take a break. And the problem with that is that you were already on a break. And so now that you acknowledge the break so that you can pray, but yet you don't pray, defeats the purpose of taking the break. All right? You have to be intentional if you're using, and I'm going to be very candid here to say, if you are a couple who says that you use this particular excuse to avoid sexual intimacy, you're playing with something that God gave you a directive to do. That if you are taking a break away from sex, it only gives you the option to do so for a time of prayer. Because what that would indicate otherwise is that your marriage or your relationship has an issue that needs to be prayed about. And that you want to get God in the center of your relationship, so therefore you need to pray Him back into it. Because usually if you're having to take a break from sex to have prayer to pray about it, it's because it's not happening. It's not because it's happening too much. All right? So be careful how you use that one. Ultimately, ladies, when you talk with your husband, tell him what you're doing and why, or as a couple, talk about it. If he knows the goal isn't less sex, but more and better sex after you prayed about it, he'll less likely feel less threatened by the time out. Number 3 is educate yourself. There's not enough room here to address all the myriad of emotional and physical aspects of sexual dysfunction, and there are plenty of good books available, but one of you or both of you may have grown up with ideas or teachings about sex that are inhibiting you now. And so if that is you, get some education. If you need to ask me about some books I can recommend for you, through this particular study, I have probably done more research with different books and things. Y'all saw the book that I brought in than any other. And so if you need some resources, I'm happy to help you with those. Check your history. Could it be that past sexual relationships are interfering in your present one? Were you involved in sexual activities earlier in life that left you feeling resentful and used? If you have a history of any kind of abuse, chances are great that you need healing from these hurtful experiences before you will begin to have a healthy attitude about intimacy with your husband. This is a complex issue that you should seek help from a professional about as soon as possible. Number 5, rule out physical problems. Sometimes physical problems such as hormone imbalances inhibit a woman's desire for sex. If you have troubles, have to do more with a lack of physical responsiveness than with emotional resistance, see a physician who specializes in that. And nowadays we see the invention of the little blue pill because of men's problems. And the challenge with that doesn't fix the desire and the libido, it just fixes the functionality. And therefore, a lot of these guys who now suddenly have this blue pill are running around and their wife's libido is no better than theirs was, but now they're having to take care of things that the blue pill caused. So we see, especially sadly in the senior adult community, a whole lot of fornication because of that. Suddenly guys who could not be functional are, but yet there's not a lot of ladies willing, and so it becomes a challenge. So number 5 was rule out physical problems. Number 6, experiment with being the initiator. In most cases where a wife is reluctant to have sex, the husband is the designed initiator. This can lead to an unhelpful pattern in which the problem only gets worse. And I want to read you an excerpt from two authors, Cliff and Joyce Penner. They said, because the wife doesn't show her interest in being together sexually, the husband begins to believe she has no interest in him sexually. His insecurity is triggered by her apparent lack of interest. So he anxiously begins to initiate sex more often than he would want it if he were feeling sure of himself in relation to her. She feels pressured by his initiation, so she begins to avoid him or pull away sexually. The more he approaches, the more consistent her avoidance. The more frequent her avoidance, the more anxious in his approach. It becomes a negative spiral. And so, guys, if this is something that you're challenged with, I need you ladies to remember to especially talk with your husband about waiting for sex until you approach him. Many men, once assured that sex will take place, aren't put off by waiting for their wives to signal their readiness. And if you are the initiator, it may remove some of the feelings of pressure and duty you experience. Instead, it hopefully could become something you're giving versus something he is always approaching you to take. I thought that was good advice. Number 7, spell it out. If a wife feels uncared for, she may believe the only interest her husband has in her is sex. He comes home from work, turns on the television, sits quietly at dinner, watches more television after dinner, but then at bedtime, he wants to become friendly. This makes her anger sizzle. Ladies, if you relate to this scenario, I want to challenge you to tell your husband exactly what it takes to please you when you guys are in the bedroom. Let him know what makes you feel happy to be invited there. You'd be amazed, and ladies, this is the truth. Men don't realize that a wife needs to be courted during the day. And when I was reading these notes to my wife last night, she gives me the look, and I'm like, I know, I got to do better. And, one of the things that my wife had grown up, her dad, didn't matter what time of the day it was, where he was, what he was doing. If she called him, he dropped everything. And she often compares my responsiveness in the same scenario to that of her dad's. Well, my dad dropped everything, always, to talk to me or take my call. And, she's right. I have been convicted about I need to make sure that my wife never feels like she is second choice in a day. Now, I can flip that on her, and if I call her most of the time, she does not answer. Thankfully, I'm not insecure about that. But, guys, as a reminder, your wife needs more interaction than 5 minutes of foreplay in the bedroom. And chances are, it probably doesn't take that much. It could be as simple as a midday phone call, kisses on the way out the door, a long hug when he gets home. But ladies, again, help your man out, please. It isn't all right. So ladies, Emily, help your man out. Be specific about what you'd enjoy and list for him several small things. List for him several small things that he could do to help you be in the mood more often. Tell him. All right. Now, if you don't listen to the list, that's on you. Number eight. Consider sexual therapy. And for some couples, the road to healthy sexual life may require outside help. Often, sexual therapy involves literally starting all over again with a clean slate. Couples typically follow a program that begins with non-sexual touching. Over the course of weeks, homework assignments build up to the actual bedroom act. So if your husband is unwilling to see a counselor with you, consider seeking help alone. You'd be surprised how much progress you can make this way. Number 9. Guys, I thought this was funny. Be honest about turnoffs. It told the story about this couple who he always wore this like medicated lotion of some kind and had this horrible smell. And when she smelt it, it was a total turnoff. And yet she never said anything until several years into the marriage, and she finally told him, and it hurt his feelings. It's like, so you've been rebuffing me all this time because I'm stanky with my lotion, and you didn't tell me. All right? So if there is something, it's important to let you know what dampens your mood. If it's something that he or she can change, let your spouse know that while you accept and love them as they are. You'd think they would be a little more sexier if they could deal with this particular problem. And if it's not, and this is a big thing, if it is not something that they can change, listen to this, the problem then becomes yours. In truth, your sexual responsiveness, if all is well, shouldn't be dampened by baldness, graying, wrinkled skin, or anything else. If they trouble you, you need to deal with your own thought patterns and values. Do what you can to try to not let them distract from the act of intimacy. And number 10, never give up. Making changes in your sex life won't necessarily come easily. Some changes might not even come at all. However, never give up or relegate sex to the old days. A healthy sex life is foundational to every marriage. I want to read this last article for you as we close it up. And this article is for the ladies, but it's one that I think y'all will hopefully be encouraged from. In this closing section, I'm going to share this article from a Christian author, blogger, and missionary, Araba Joy. Anybody ever heard of her? Araba? I don't know if it's Araba or Araba Joy. She wrote this article called For the Christian Marriage Bed, 7 Tips for a Better Sex Life. No, I'm not going to give you the 7 tips, but I do have, for the ladies, a copy of those 7. So ladies, if you'd like a copy of this, I want to give them to you, but I want to explain what she says before I go there. But before I get her quote, I like to point out that she begins her article by admitting, hey, I'm not an expert on this subject. As a matter of fact, I'm a little uncomfortable talking about it. And I looked at her work and I looked at who she was, and this woman really does say, you know, I'm uncomfortable talking about this. And we in the church are, but it still needs to be talked about. But she was saying that for the women that she mentors, she felt she needed to address a very unhealthy mindset she felt was growing amongst Christian women. And she writes, I believe the greatest reason Christian women have ho-hum sex lives is because we have watered down vision regarding sexual intimacy. When sex is just about feeling good or pared down to a set of rules like don't do it before marriage or you got to do it once you're married, when sex is an obligation or marriage duty, when it is associated with guilt or shame or just plain exhaustion, we lose sight of the glory God intended to display through the marriage bed. We become visionless to the depth and grace of sexual intimacy. We begin to wonder what the big deal is anyway. This is what happens when we've lost the eyes to see the grandeur, the mystery, the deep implications, and sacred holiness of our sexuality. She says, I believe the greatest thing we as Christian women can do to regain our sight, our spark, and our sizzle in the bedroom is not to try a new technique or purchase new lingerie. It isn't to read a steamy book or watch a soft porn movie. I believe the greatest thing we can do is pray for vision. When Jesus asked the visionless man, what do you want? His response was the expected, to see. He replied, do we likewise realize how blind we are to the spiritual dimensions of sexual intimacy? Do we realize how we've dumbed it down? And do we really, really want to see? Sight is what I want, she writes. I want to see the beauty, the gift, the power, the glory, the grandeur, the holiness of Christian marriage sex as God intended it. I want that for us as a whole, for every Christian woman whose birthright has given her this inheritance. I thought that was cool. I thought that was great. And if you want a quote of that, you can follow that particular blog that I listed there. And she has given you 7 things that you can pray as a woman to help bring perhaps some sexual healing into your own mind and heart, for you to have a new vision about how you look at sex. These are 7 tips that she wrote, and I thought they were very, very good. They're included with scriptures and prayers that you can pray. So her challenge is to pray one of these every single day this week. Pray one prayer a day and see what God does. And she gives you a little wink at the end. So, all right. The next and final question that we had was the one that the guys asked at the end of last week is, what do women want from sex? So guys, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is I have some great answers to your question. The bad news is you're going to have to come back next week to get them. All right? So guys, we are out of time even before our discussion questions. Guys, I hope this information was helpful. This is a lot to cover. This was a full slate today, but I hope that this has been helping you. And next week we're going to talk about what do women want from sex, lust, versus desire in overcoming your past. We're going to address those three next week. And guys, then on September 26th, you guys be sure to be back. Ted Cunningham. We're going to replay our Ted Cunningham session on intimacy from our marriage conference last November. It is awesome. It wraps all this up and ties it in a perfect little bow. And so I hope you guys will be here for that one as well. And then in early September, you guys will see new teachers. If y'all are tired of me, you'll see some new teachers for a bit. So guys, thank you for being here today. And sorry that I kept you so late, but hope y'all have a great week. As always, if I can help you with a situation that we talk about in class or something that as you drive home creates a challenge and y'all need to talk to me, always know that you can email me or text me, and I'm happy to help where I can. Let me pray for us before we go, and then I'll let you guys get out of here. Father, we thank you today for the opportunity to study, Father, a subject that for a lot of people is uncomfortable. Even in great marriages, intimacy is often a difficult area to discuss. And Father, I pray that you forgive us as a church, Lord, as we have often hidden behind improper reasonings for not talking more openly about intimacy in marriage, because it has such a significant impact on those marriages, Lord. And I just pray that as we've looked at intimacy these past 3 weeks, that you've enriched our marriages and our relationships, not only in the area of intimacy, but Father, in the way that we communicate to each other about this very important area. And Father, I lift up those that were not here today, but that they are still struggling in their own marriage with intimacy. Father, I pray that you begin to provide the healing necessary, Father, for the sacred oneness of their intimacy, Father, to be restored and to begin to live itself out in their marriage. Father, we ask your blessings on our sermon today as we go to worship, and we lift all this to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, guys.